Um, I love Agnes, like, love Agnes. I feel like, you're just in for such a treat when she talks about adverse childhood experiences. It's just so enriching because not only you can read her bio here, she has a lot of experience, but she's lived this. She grew up with this. And, whenever I've talked about ACEs, you might know them as ACEs, or you might be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So don't worry, Agnes will fill you in and you'll be an expert by the time she's finished, at least in your own story. But when I took an ACEs test for my youngest, not my oldest, not the one that had the crisis, but my youngest, he scored 4 out of 10, and I got scared. I was traumatized by that. And then people like Agnes, who just walked through what is that test for? What is ACEs for? Really brought me back to earth, and got me off the cliff of my own shame, and just really invited me into being brave about the story that we had in our family. And again, I just want to say, no matter where you're from, no matter who you are in our chat today, mental health issues, trauma is not just in certain families. It's everywhere. It's in affluent areas. It's in the ghetto. It's educated people and uneducated. It's everyone. And so if you've had a story of anything that Agnes is going to talk about, and then Shelly, I'll introduce her when Agnes is finished, but Shelly's going to walk us home today. If you've had any experience with any kind of trauma, you're not alone. And what's beautiful about this webinar is that you're hidden in your house, you're not seen, and yet we do see you. And we want to reach right where you are, in your living room, in your bedroom, wherever you are, trying to get away from your children, perhaps in the bathroom, and just having this hour to focus on your own self-care and going inwards. And so what I ask of everyone today is for some bravery. And I just want to declare right now that this is a shame-free zone. Shame, we're not going to allow it to speak into our lives today. We're going to move forward, and we're going to experience a lot of truth and a lot of hope. So on that note, I welcome you, Agnes, to take the floor.
Thank you. I thought I would add in, as you were talking about the shame-free zone. So when Connie had her conference a few weeks ago, and I did a quick little speedy chat, my husband watched it afterwards, and he said to me, he had really great feedback and words to say. He pointed out this one area where when I talk about adverse childhood experiences, and when they did the study, and I'll touch a little bit on that in a second here, there are 10 different, sort of factors that that played into what your score was. My husband said, when I said, when I talked about what my score was, I said 6 or 7. I realized, looking back, I said that. And, obviously I went through what I was going to talk about. It was 7, but I said 6 initially because 7 sounds so much worse. And when you look at the study, they talk about if you have 4 or more, what your risk is for. If you say 7, your risk increases for other areas. And that was coming from a place of shame because, initially when I said that, I didn't want to be in that category of 7. And then when I talked about, there are kids in our classrooms, I said I was one of those kids. And I said, maybe my kids are in that. Maybe, I know if my kids are a part of that, but I still said maybe. So that idea of shame is really hard to break away from. And I recognize that, and I struggle with it now. And I thank you, Connie, for providing this platform for many people to share parts of their story, because I think it is really important. So if you'd like, Connie, I can just give a quick kind of summary of what ACEs are, I guess, and kind of go from there, and then we can chat. So essentially, the term ACEs stands for adverse childhood experiences, and where that comes from was more than 2 decades ago, there were 2 doctors who did the adverse childhood experiences study. And essentially what they did was they asked 17,000 individuals. So this was a huge study. However, keep in mind, it was mostly middle-class white families that they interviewed in this 17,000 individuals when we're looking at the population. And what they asked is if they had experienced any abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction. And now, when we think about abuse, it includes physical, emotional, and sexual neglect, emotional or physical neglect, household dysfunction, so living with a parent with a mental illness, living with a parent with an addiction, having a parent who has been incarcerated, losing a parent to death or divorce, or a parent who has been incarcerated. So when we think of all of those, when I thought about my life, when I first heard about this study 10 years ago, it was very eye-opening. And when it sounds very hopeless, and I talk about this, it sounds, well, this tells us that a lot of people are living this. The study showed that 2 in 3 individuals have at least one adverse childhood experience, but 85% of those have 2 or more. So we know ACEs don't generally come on their own. It showed individuals who had 4 or more was 1 in 8 individuals. So again, big numbers. And then it showed that your risk of having a mental illness, of having, suicidal thoughts, as well as physical illness, went up substantially. Now, all of that is important information because for me, I know when I first read about it, truthfully, and maybe it sounds a little bit barbaric, but it was hopeful, and I felt so held in that moment, because growing up in a home where there was addiction and mental illness, you feel very alone and isolated. That's my story anyways. And in speaking with a lot of people, it's not uncommon to feel that way, of course, because there is an understanding. We can be empathetic and we can have compassion, but nobody just says, this is what I grew up with. No, you have behaviors. Maybe you cry a lot, or you ruminate a lot about negative things that are happening. And it's coming from a really dark and scary place because our brain has adjusted and shifted to see the world in such a different way. We're constantly navigating and living our life saying, you are safe, you are not. You looked at me a certain way, you spoke to me a certain way, and you just don't understand. And I love, there's that quote that says, being understood is almost more important than being loved, because you feel loved in that moment. So in any case, this learning about this study really kind of set me on a different trajectory in my life, in my personal, professional life, recognizing that I'm not alone. This is huge, but nobody talks about it. And, for the amount of police officers and first responders and EMTs that came to our home, and unfortunately, they are bombarded and overworked, and we know this about our first responders. But often in those moments, high stress moments, when a child is looking to that help and sees the shame that comes instead, it's hard to feel understood and supported. So adverse childhood experiences. So when we talk about those 3 things, abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, the statistics are huge. They did a study in Alberta as well that the numbers were very similar. So it's not uncommon. In Alberta, we have, 23% of our population struggles with substance use. So again, these conversations aren't happening. We put them in boxes somewhere else, but they happen to us, right? They happen to our kids. They happen to kids in our kids' classrooms. And how do we hold those stories and better understand and support those stories, especially when it comes to our children? In a better capacity. And in the same breath, and I touched on this, Connie, at your conference, when I recognized that I wasn't alone, and it gave me that hopefulness. No, it did not make my life easier. No, it did not take away any of that stress. But what it did is it started me on that path that I needed to say, okay, this is common. What can I do about it? And it helped me to understand that what is trauma? What does adversity in early childhood do? And it stresses us out, right? It bombards our stress system. So we are just wired all the time, and we are triggered all the time. And it might not be the same for everybody, and it might be in different capacities, but I was able to recognize when I was triggered and how I was triggered and how I was reacting to the people around me, to my kids, and how that overactive stress response system I became a trigger for my kids. And so it was recognizing that their stress response system was overactive, and how I knew this had to change. So long story about adverse childhood experiences, but how it is a really hopeful story, because the science and statistics tells us this is real and alive in our communities, but the science also tells us that we can be healed through relationships and through supportive and caring communities that can come together and hold each other up. in those really hard times that we don't like to talk about, but we got to talk about them.
Yeah, we have to talk about them. When our friend Sarah Austin shares that Canada's number 25 in the world for child safety, I want to just break that down for a minute. Safety, we think of abuse, we think of people, those people who hit their kids. But could I challenge us all to look at abuse as neglect? And we might think, I don't abuse my kid, but neglect is a real problem. And what I hear from the ACEs story is I hear this idea of neglect. And one of the hardest things for myself was when I realized how much I had neglected my kids due to neglect here. And it wasn't intentional. Nobody in our call has intention to ever neglect. Our heart is pure, and we love our kids. The reason why we're number 25 in the world is because we don't know how to talk about the times when we have struggled. The time that I would get so frustrated with my kids that I would yell and grab one of them by the shoulders in that moment. Who am I telling that to? I'm not telling anybody. I'm keeping that to myself because someone could very easily misjudge me, and I don't ever want to say we should normalize violence. Never, never, never. My mom fled domestic violence when I was one, and I'm glad she did. But at the same time, you're right, Agnes, if we don't have these safe places where we can share our weakness so that others can come around us to give us strength to be this, to call out who we really are. I don't know if you saw that beautiful, it was like a picture that went around social media for a while there of this African village. When somebody would do something wrong, or they were caught in something that was bad, they were actually brought to the middle of the village and everyone called out who they were. Blew my brain. uh,
Mhm.
you know um, could you maybe speak, like, I would never want to think that anyone in this call is void of this neglect in their lives. Like, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think that was a lot of information that to reflect on, even in all you said. Um, how you made the comment about holding space for that. I think we often hear about vulnerability, and it is being able to use our voices, but it is very hard to use our voices when we don't have that supportive environment. And so what comes first? That supportive environment that allows us to feel safe and talk about it, or we talk about it and we feel safe, right? And it's sort of how to balance those two things. And even as parents, it's one of those things of, our kids come to us crying and that's a sign of vulnerability, but they are interrupting our day to day, right?
Mhm.
And so how do we create that space where we can really acknowledge that vulnerability and the feelings that they have, all those fluffy things that we often talk about. um, in terms of neglect, how do we when you say neglect, do you mean in ourselves or in our kids? Or
Both.
Yeah, I think, for me personally, it's been one of those things recognizing, and it's a lifelong journey, how I mentioned that it's not like things were magically better. Triggers didn't go away. They probably never will. The struggle every day is real. I grew up in a home where mental illness and addiction existed. Those same struggles exist today, and they will for a really long time. But how we can manage them, and knowing that we are not alone in that, and also recognizing when it is beyond our capacity and when we do need that outside help, whether it is through a counselor, whether it is through other sources. It's removing the shame from all of it and just recognizing what is being neglected in myself. And when I recognize that, I could recognize how I was neglecting my kids, and where I needed to improve that relationship with them. And because I was neglecting so many of my needs that I didn't know I had, because trauma is a horrible word. Adverse childhood experiences is horrible to think about it. And we just don't grow up thinking about it in that context. I don't think about, how I physically neglected or emotionally abused my kids, because those are horrible conversations to have. I want to look a certain way and fit into a certain box because I didn't feel I did my whole life, right? So we create these personas. But when we really normalize those sort of light and dark sides and can recognize this is what exists in me, when I have neglected that and things might not change, what are the small steps, the small goals of, Kate, I need to see somebody and be able to talk about this. If it's not with my friends, then I need to talk with somebody. And then how can I connect those pieces to my kids, and how can I become that safe place for my own kids, so I'm not neglecting their needs, because that is going to be what enables them to grow with resilience. That idea of being able to form those relationships and maintain those relationships, and feel good in life. We say choose happiness, but we can choose happiness when we feel happy, when we have the experiences that tell us we belong and we are valued and we are loved. We can go and choose happiness.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that answers your question, Connie, or how, if I looped around a little bit, but I think that those are really important parts to my story. I will say, I did have to go on medication, and that was really challenging for me. So this might take the conversation a little bit differently, but there is a lot of shame in that sometimes, is talking about having to go on something that, I remember thinking it's going to alter my brain. I don't want my brain to be altered. I want to be proud of who I am. The reality was my experience is already altered so much that was going inside of me. And that was something that really was challenging for me to accept, to go on. And then I did, and it is just a normal part of my life, and it allows me to live in a capacity that can be present for myself and my kids, and to not constantly be in that triggered zone. After running half marathons and running every day and eating all the greens I could for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, sometimes we have to look past and say, I am doing everything I can. What more can I do? And so that is also okay. And I know often people, that comes from I have lots of conversations where people say there's no way I would ever go on anything. But again, I want to be real and say that is a part of my story as well. That, like I said, things didn't magically go away when I learned about the adverse childhood experiences study. Triggers didn't go away. I still, battle depression and anxiety, but it's manageable. Life is manageable, and I can hold it all and make space for it all, in myself, in my kids, and for others. And that is the most hopeful story, because sometimes we feel really hopeless when we're struggling, especially with our kids, right? But it's all good.
Yeah. No, and that's so good to mention, Agnes. Everyone is on this journey, and you're making it so that if anyone felt like medication was scary, to know that it is there as a help and a support. I know my husband. We've been married 21 years this June, and we've gotten along for one of it. No, he has anxiety. I have ADHD. I mean, that's just a bomb waiting to go off, really. I mean, and many of the experiences in our house came from this idea of Ruben, my husband, always felt this tension inside of him, this anxiety that just never let up. And he went on antidepressants, and he said, I can't believe it. I don't feel that nagging pain every day. And so, just to clarify to everyone, we are not we are not being sponsored by Prozac. We're not here to say you should go on medication. I think what I'm hearing you say, Agnes, is you need to honor your journey.
Mhm. Yeah, and how you said, when we think of neglect, it's recognizing what is missing and what might help, right? It's not never going to be a straight path, and it's figuring that out. And until we dig deep and can acknowledge that, and kind of peel off those layers of shame that we all have, that's when we can just start really, seeing where that's coming from, and better ourselves and the lives around us because of it. So, yeah.
I think it's beautiful that you are so brave with your story, because then for anyone in the call today, they feel like they can be brave with their story. And when I switched from working with youth at risk and resilience in youth to adults, I found it was hard. It was a hard switch, because adults are so afraid. I mean, maybe even to show up to this webinar, there's fear, and you're not sure if you even are safe here. Like, it's such a trigger. And I talk to many youth, like even my son's friends, they actually like me. I think that's hilarious. My 13-year-old's friends like me. And and they say, we hate our parents. And it's hard for me in those moments because I realize those parents are trying their darndest to be whoever they need to be every day for those kids. This constant disconnect, um, and parents, I think they just need a real safe place where it's like, just put your feet up, take a nice deep breath, and we have a big drink of water for you here. And people like yourself, Agnes, who share very honestly about your story, reminds parents that, yeah, these are common human experiences. Anger is a human experience. Sadness, rage, all those things that we have implicit, all those implicit memories that have buried, we buried them because we don't want to face them. When someone like yourself shares, it opens something. And uh, someone is saying in the chat, thanking you, the fear and the struggle with medication and accepting it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're all here to support you.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And I think I had a friend who brought it up to me at first, and I thought, no, I'm not going to see a counselor because they're not going to fix my problems, and I'm not going to go on medication because it'll change me. But yeah, I think it's when we change the conversation and talk about how things can help us and how we think about the potential that we have within ourselves and what aspects of our mental health journey will support that. We have all options have to be on the table, right? And it's okay if you don't. I think it's just feeling safe in that decision. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. Jody says this is the second time she's heard you. And
Aw.
first time she's like, oh, this doesn't relate to me, but this time around it's speaking to you. And I think sometimes we're not. It takes a couple of times to go there in our hearts, and by all means, we're certainly not saying that everyone relates 100%. But being brave about our own stories, I think absolutely every single parent can relate to that. So I just want to thank you so much for being here, Agnes. I know that you've taken time out of your work day. You have to go back to work, but any closing thoughts for us?
Um, yeah, I think I guess I'll end on even how Jody said, the first time she heard me speak, which was likely Connie at your conference. And I think that's sort of oftentimes we hear about adverse childhood experiences. And to be honest, when I first started opening up to a lot of my friends, the reaction was, I don't know anybody who has that story. How are you so normal? And I think the thing that we connect on really is when we can recognize the struggles that we all have, and whether you've lived through certain adversities or not. That study touched on 10, but there are other forms of adversity that happen where our stress system is bombarded and overwhelmed, whether you're a child or whether it's once you become an adult. And I think that's where the connected piece is. We all know what it feels like to be really sad, and to be sad maybe for those prolonged periods and needing the support of other people. I think we all know what it feels like to be mad. So when we can recognize someone is constantly mad, what does that feel like and what does that look like within ourselves? So those pieces we can always connect on. And I think, thank you, Jody, for commenting on that, because I think that that's such an important part of the puzzle. Is something seems so far removed from each of us because we have no experience with it. But if we can just go back to what that would feel like, we will always find connection in that place, and we will always find room to hold those people through those feelings. So thank you, Connie, for always creating such great dialogue, and for everybody who is listening. The first time or second time around.
Great. Yes. Well, and I can't wait for the third time. Agnes is a good friend, and I always holler in whenever we need to learn more. So thanks, Agnes, and we hope you have a great day. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See you.
See you. Well, that was really, really wonderful, and I'm so thankful to have Shelly, who is a counselor. She's a clinical counselor. We work together now with the Brave Parent Institute, and Agnes was here to open up the conversation about trauma. But I'm thankful to say that we're not ending there. That she's gonna walk us home, and I just want to introduce you to her. She is absolutely phenomenal, this woman, and she has so much experience. Look at that, we're in the middle. Um, so much experience about working with the hardest of the hard, and she has been in the trenches. If you just look at this bio, I mean, it's unbelievable. And so she is no stranger to hard things, and she leans in so well with people, and she's here because she's safe. And I just want you to take a nice deep breath, and Shelly, feel free to lead us.
Okay. Well, thank you, Connie, for having me here. And hi, everybody. Thank you for all being here with us today. Um, Gosh, so much about what Agnes said. I just wanted to jump in so many times. And, you know, she had so many amazing things to say. I think that, I really want to start out with saying that when we are in this place of, scoring a 7 or an 8 on ACEs, or scoring a 1 or even a 0 on that particular, test, we all have trauma. We all have experiences that have made us feel overwhelmed, whether that is with those big emotions of anger or sadness, not knowing how to engage with our kids, getting angry and frustrated. What I think is really important to remember is if we grew up in those places of trauma and hard things, we need to remember it wasn't us who caused them. It wasn't us who created those situations as these little beings. Our parents came with their own packages, with their own things that they needed to deal with. The same thing with us being parents. We've come with our own packages. And when we are doing that parenting, and when we are trying to deal with some of that big stuff in our house, whether it's ACEs or whether it's other traumas that we're dealing with, a death of a loved one or loss of a job, all of those things can feel traumatic for us. So I don't want people to be here and feeling like, well, I'm not on this test and I haven't scored, but does my trauma count? Yes, it does. And it's all okay, as Agnes said. We can manage it, we can deal with it. And if we're in those places, as I was saying, of parenting, and we've showed up with a big emotion, that's okay, because we can still walk through it. Sometimes we lose ourselves for a moment, and it's all right, because you know what? We are wired for survival. We are wired to recover. We are wired to be able to adapt to different situations. And I think it's really important to acknowledge as well that if we come from a place of trauma, whether that's big T or little t trauma, when we are trying to work through it, we need to find, as Agnes was saying, and as you say all the time, Connie, that safety. We need to find safety to be able to talk about it with, whether that being our partner, a good friend, a counselor, or support groups. We also need to be able to find a place to process that trauma, because what I know from my almost 30 years of work in a variety of fields is that it doesn't actually go away. It will still sit with us and show up in different ways when we didn't expect it to. And sometimes we've also dealt with it, and then we've gotten married, and then we've had kids, and it's showing up again, but in a different way than it did before. And I have people come to my office all the time and say, I thought I dealt with this. I've done counseling before. I've done all this. But it's showing up in different ways. We get triggered in different ways. So remembering we're wired for survival, we're wired for hard things, and we're wired to adapt and make changes. And it's not all on us. It's from our blueprint. It's from our toolbox. It's from the package that we were given across time. So when we're thinking a little bit about some of our traumas, how is that showing up for us? How are we showing up in being loved? How are we showing up in loving people? Our conflict management? How are we being successful in, navigating and discovering what some of those big things for us are? So awareness and attention is really the number one thing. If we're not aware that we have a big T trauma or a little t trauma that is bubbling up for us, how do we find the right tools, skills, or strategies to be able to put in place to work through that for ourselves, or to build those new tools for our kids? So I like to think about it a little bit like building a town or building a little village. So when you think about, we're newborn babies, we have our babies, we were those babies, and we've got this blank slate. But now we're building this town, our brain. Our brain is being developed by our parents, our families, our upbringings. And we're putting a building in here, and we're building different roadways, and we're building different paths. And our town is getting more and more established as we get older. And now we're these adults and we have a fairly established town, but we don't necessarily like how some of those roadways are built. They can still be adapted. And this is where it's so important. What Agnes was talking about in those ACEs is that we know the science tells us and shows us that we can see things look different. I don't want people to ever think I'm going to erase that whole road. It's not going to exist anymore. That blueprint is still going to be there, but you get to build a bridge. You get to build, a new pathway, a new tower. It could be a walkway, whatever you want that to be. But creating that awareness and intention is the first thing that we need to be able to do for ourselves. Because then when we're building our little packages, our little towns for our kids, we can do some of that rewiring, rebuilding, rejigging. And when we're thinking about, how do we find support? How do we get help? I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the places I've been and worked and some of the experiences. I started out my career working in maximum security prison with youth who had lots of different big things happening in their families. Sometimes they, had their parents were incarcerated in the building next door, and talking to them. Way back then, almost 30 years ago, ACEs didn't really exist. We didn't know what we were talking about at that point. And then we move into the world of child welfare and child protection. I've seen and felt lots of trauma in those places, working in the area of domestic violence, addiction, significant mental health. The vast majority of the time, whether it's been a child or an adult I've been working with, when we spend some time creating that awareness, there's something that popped up at some point in their life that's creating something that's holding them back. That road is built and they want to navigate a different pathway. So when we're thinking about that safety of who do we talk to, how do I process this, how do I deal with this, we need to find that safe person for sure. And if that's a counselor should never make you feel as though this situation was ever in your control. A counselor should never make you feel that this is all going to go away and be perfect and beautiful and, sunshine and rainbows, because it's part of your story. But what a counselor can do is provide skills and tools and strategies to be able to think about it in a different way, to be able to help you rebuild your town and your road at your pace when you're ready. And this should be done by setting goals. Most people know when they come to a counselor what they want to talk about, but there's also places that feel really safe for people, because not everyone wants to come see a counselor. There are organizations like Agnes, right? And I think Connie will probably post that in our blog at some point along the way. There are groups that we can go to learn different skills around money management, if that is where we were really triggered because our family lived in poverty and we were challenged and that was traumatic for us. There are places where we can go in group settings to learn more about parenting skills and parenting tools, where we're surrounded with a group of people that are challenged with some of the same things, to create that safety and feeling of a village to reconstruct our roads, to be able to move forward in some of those tough and challenging things. So remember that this is bite size. If we have 13 years or 2 years or 35, 45, 50 years of trauma, we need to take it in bite-sized pieces. We can't come in and unload it all at one time and think it's going to be okay. It should be done in small bite-sized pieces with little bite-sized goals, so we see that we are getting some traction, so we feel that we're getting some skills and tools that are happening along the way. When we're thinking about some of the big things around trauma, whether it's that big T trauma or little t trauma, lots of anxiety shows up, depression, being easily emotionally triggered by things and maybe not understanding where or why that's showing up for us. A fear of speaking what our truths are, like you and Agnes were both talking about. That can feel like trauma in and of itself, of talking about when we just lost it at our kids. I have 3 myself, 14, 11, and 7. I'm sure that they would have some things to say about me. You know, we can have that lack of confidence. There's shame that shows up for us. Challenging communication skills. We don't know how to voice what's happening for us if we're not aware of where some of those big triggers are coming from, or where some of those big emotions are coming from. Sometimes we lack those negotiation skills, right? How many of us have ever said, you know, our kids have said something to us and we're like, because I'm the parent, or I said so, right? How many of us have done and said that? Yeah, I have definitely said that. Well, I think most of us, if we're parents, have said that. And that can feel challenging for us, especially when they start getting to be 13 or 14-year-olds and they're saying, well, why you do that? Or, you know, pushing back a little bit. And we're not certain on how to communicate because of maybe some of the ways that our package, our town is built, because we never got those skills. That we don't know how to deal with conflict besides maybe yelling, or for some people pushing or shoving. If we don't have those tools or skills, how do we do that? Right? So when we have insecure attachments with our families, or challenging big T, little t traumas with our families, we do bring that in. We do bring that in. Even if we don't have children, if there are people sitting here that don't have children, it still impacts our adult relationships in how we connect with people. Because we know when people are dealing with some of those big traumas, and it does impact how we connect in our relationships. It does impact, you know, our dependence or independence, how open and safe we feel with those people in our lives, being able to set those things up. What do our boundaries look like? You know, I've worked with some people who they jump from one relationship to the next relationship, and they're not certain why it's falling apart, and because they're not feeling confident in themselves. They're looking for something, but really this is where we need to be. This is where we need to be. And I'm not going to lie, the work can feel hard, and the work can feel messy in the middle. And I've had people say, I kind of just don't like this conversation today, Shelly. I just kind of don't want to go there. Because it's a hard journey. It wasn't easy going through it then. We can pull it apart, but also we need to think about our future. How do we want that to look? We are resilient. We have gained some kind of skills from the traumas that we've survived. We have gained knowledge and independence and patience in different ways. We've gained a lot of intuition of situations when we're sitting in them, when we have dealt with some of these big things, when we've dealt with some of these big and triggering things. So when you're thinking about yourself and, you know, like, my parents were divorced, but actually it wasn't toxic and things were pretty good, oftentimes there may still be something within our relationships that we think, oh my gosh, if I have one argument or one fight, that's it, we're going to end in a divorce. Or, you know, we never argue, we never fight, we're going to end in a divorce because we don't communicate, right? So some of these things in our relationships can look really different depending where they come from, you know, for each and every one of us, which is big to think about. We talk and we hear lots about this emotion regulation. You know, being emotionally dysregulated comes with the territory of some of these ACEs, because those stressful times have built our towns differently. Those stressful moments have built the way that we look at life differently. And it can be challenging for us to regulate some of those big emotions when those are the ones that are in our toolbox, when those are the ones that we carry around all the time, and those are our go-tos. And so being able to understand some of those deeper emotions. And, you know, I talk about this all the time with people, is that we have 4 or 5 core emotions that probably most all of us know. We have anger, we have sadness, joy, fear, and disgust. And even when you're talking to kids or adults, they'll say, yeah, I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling angry. But once we are aware of what those big ones are and we can dig down underneath, we can start looking at strategies and skills and tools and awareness and creating different ways to navigate some of our relationships.
This is very, very rich, Shelly. Very rich. And Brenda and I were just saying in the chat how we really enjoy this analogy of the town. It just puts it in perspective for us. And there's a couple of questions here. Jody's asking if you've worked with families through FSCD funding, and if you have experience with families of children with ASD or ADHD or depression.
Mhm. I haven't worked particularly under that area of funding in my private practice. I'm aware of it and have worked alongside it in many of the different places and spaces that I have worked. With ADHD and anxiety, depression, thoughts and behaviors of suicide, conflict management, anger management, all of those things are my world and are my wheelhouse. And when I work with families and children, I like to ensure that you're the one who is feeling empowered in any of our situations. So, I do offer free 30 minutes to have a conversation and ask those big questions. Lots of people, Connie, you and I have talked about, have gone to counselors and maybe have not had the best experiences. I'm very cautious in and around this because it is my field and my passion. But there are some experiences people have and they will go one or two times and they just don't want to go. So finding that right fit is so important. So if that funding piece is something that's so critical, I could probably try and find a colleague that I can link you to. If you have very specific questions and we have a conversation and you feel like I'm not the right fit, I can probably link you to somebody who may have that right fit, because we know when we're seeking supports, whether that's counseling, whether that is groups, whether that is organizations that can help, that connection is actually the most important thing that we can have to make progress. So I'm not sure if I've actually answered that question fully for you, Jody. Hopefully I have, but worked alongside that funding. But yes, all those things you're asking, definitely in my wheelhouse, and see it almost daily along with individuals struggling with, suicide and marriage challenges. And
Shelly's been around. She's
been around.
been around. Another question from another parent is, as a parent, can we help our children heal from ACEs even when they want nothing to do with us?
Yes. So this is something that I say to parents all the time is we are the mirror to our children. We are the mirror to our children. So whether we are parents of still, youth and kiddos, and they have ACEs, if we want to see change in them, we need to be the change we want to see. So how many of us have done this before? Your child comes in, or your teen comes in, and they're talking back to you a little bit, and then you snap back at them, and then they yell at you and you say, "Don't yell at me." And we're like, okay, so maybe I'm not doing such a good job in being the mirror. And oftentimes, if we want to see that change, we need to be that change. And now, my friends, it's going to be tough. Patience, persistence, and practice. Those are my 3 P's that I love to repeat to parents, is patience, persistence, and practice. So if your kiddos have gone through some big T traumas and you want to be able to navigate this with them, yeah, absolutely, 100%, you can do this with them. But it's going to be about taking some of those inside looks of where have been some of my downfalls. That's sometimes hard for us to look at. Depending on the age of them, we need to be able to tell them. And I will often say to my 14-year-old, I made a mistake today. I didn't approach that situation in the way that I wanted to, and I owe you an apology because you were trying to be the big person and I didn't show up in a good way. And so we need to be those mirrors, right, that are constantly reflecting that, and we need to be those mirrors that are constantly trying to have those conversations, and that feels really, really hard sometimes. And when our kids don't want to be a part of that and they don't want to be engaged with us at all, and they're constantly pushing back or shutting the door on us, that can be a lot harder, and it can feel a lot heavier, and it can feel like a lot more work. But if they're still at an age and stage, 24 and younger, and they're still living at home, we still have the ability to be those mirrors. And why do I say 24? Because their brains are not fully developed till they're 25. So we can still build their town a little bit more.
Yeah, that's so good. And keep showing up, because I know in our family, my son didn't want anything to do with me for a while there. Even there's some days because he's 13. And honestly, it took a year. Took a year of showing up consistently, being that mirror. Um, and so we live in such a society of, like, let's get this done by Friday. Okay, I have a time limit, and really, it does take a lot of time. Um, Another question, or a comment, and this I feel
Yeah.
like many parents probably feel, is I feel like I'm doing this with my kids, especially my daughter, all day long, and being busy working from home with a very busy job. And then I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
That alone is exhausting. And then doing this is exhausting. What would you say to probably every parent in the call who's feeling this right now?
Yeah. And you know what? I am a huge believer in giving them some power. And I am a huge believer in developing what I like to call grit in our kids. Is that if we want to know, so I'm doing this all day long. I'm trying to be there for my child. You know what? I work with a lot of youth, and a lot of times they say, gosh, do my parents not understand? I'm happy to have these conversations 2 or 3 days of the week for an hour. That is actually going to be more quality than the quantity, than how much I'm trying to give all the time. Because you're right, that's going to be exhausting. You are going to totally burn out if you're doing it all the time. And my little guy, he's even 7. Or even, he is 7. He is 7. And starting to build it in when they're little. So if you have those littlies, and even those big guys, we need to start being able to say, I know that was a hard event. So I'll use an example of my grandmother passed away a few years ago. My little guy was just about 6. He was 5 at the time. And this was very traumatic for him. And he just wanted to be shut in his room, crying, crying, crying. And as a parent, I wanted to be in there, and I wanted to be able to talk him through grief and talk him through this event of loss of his grandparent. But what it needed to do, even at that little age, is say, you need to come to me when you're ready. You come to me when you're ready. Because as parents, we need to develop some of those skills in our kids as well. We need to let them process what is this emotion? What am I thinking about here? Maybe they're going to come to you and they're just going to yell and they're going to lose it, and that's okay. I'm always saying as well, their behaviors are their words. And even when they're 13 and 14 years old and they're turning up the heat of skipping classes, talking back, sneaking out of the house, whatever that might be, their behavior is their words, and they're trying to navigate something and they're not sure how to do that. So let them come to you a little bit more, Christiane, and let them navigate a little bit more. We don't have to be everything to everyone. That's not our job either. It's not our job either. We need to teach them the skills for independence as much as teach them the skills to work through the trauma.
That's really, really good advice. I don't know if you're noticing, but Shelly is amazing. Shelly is awesome. And someone was asking, how do I get in touch with you for counseling? So Shelly, I put your website on there, but I also want to let you know that Shelly and I are doing something called the Brave Parent Institute. And it's not just Shelly. Shelly is our clinical counselor. With the Brave Parent Institute, it's a community. We've been talking about a safe place this hour, and I promise you that wasn't scripted. It's the truth. Honestly, we have to have a village around us, and we need safe people. I don't recommend pouring your junk out on Facebook. I don't recommend that ever, because people don't know how to support. They don't, it floodlights them, as Brene Brown says, and we're lost with knowing how to support. And so Shelly has so graciously, because she's a very generous lady, she is giving 50% off counseling to anyone who is in the Brave Parent Institute. And so you don't have to do this. You can reach out to her. Her website is in the chat. If you didn't get it, I can send it to you. You could reach out to her, but I'm just letting you know that that she does offer that for our institute, as well as we have coaches, we have a health coach, we do weekly parent coaching that's specific, because as you've probably noticed as you're listening, you're wondering, how does this apply to me? Like, okay, I get the concept. Now, how do you really narrow this in for my scenario? And that's what the Institute is for. It is everything I wish I would have had when we were in crisis with our son. I wish I could have just found resources that were just so easy. And I wish I would have found Shelly, who is also covered by insurance. That would have just been great, because I didn't have great experiences with counseling either. For no one's fault, it's just the way it is. And so we really do encourage you not to do this alone, to reach out to someone. If it's not Shelly, if it's not the Brave Parent Institute, if it's not, reach out to someone, because at this point, at 8 weeks in quarantine, things are about to get a little loopy. They can. I'm not I'm not speaking that over you. I'm just saying, statistically, whenever there's any kind of isolation, week 8 and beyond can we're just done. And so we need to journey together. We need to have a safe village where we can grow and learn and really just have that support system. And so, Shelly, any closing thoughts for anyone, for us, before we head out?
Hmm. Yeah. I think kind of two things pop up for me. My experience has been, when I talk to people about, the big stuff, the hard stuff, no matter what the stuff, um, I use the town, the village building a lot, but I also use the emotional backpack. And I talk about this a lot, is that when we're growing up, when we've had, maybe breakups of marriage, when we maybe have had loss of a job and loss of a parent, whatever it might be, we're adding these big emotions into our backpack. And some days it can feel like, or weeks or months or years for some people, that we're carrying this backpack that's, 70, 80 pounds. And we can't quite reach in there. We don't know how to pull out those big emotions. And when we're finding support, whether it's through counseling or groups, what we really want to be doing is pulling out the big bubbles of these emotions that are sitting in our backpack, so that we can take a look at them, see what they are. Some of them are going to go back in there, but they might be smaller bubbles rather than big boulders that we're carrying around. And we want to be able to let them go, so that maybe our backpack is only 10 pounds rather than 70. Because when we have that space, we can make more space for ourselves, but then we've got more space for others. So I think that's really important. And safety, safety, safety in those connections of who you're seeing and connecting with. Patience, practice, and persistence. Patience, practice, and persistence.
So good. I would love to invite everyone, just before we go, just to even take that moment to reflect on your emotional backpack, and maybe today, at some point, even right now, we could just think of one thing, one something emotional that we've been carrying, and just maybe put it in our hands right now, and just release it. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't come back into the suitcase or into the backpack, but just to really put it in our hands, and let it go. And as you do that, I would really love to speak our mantra over you, that I am brave. I show up when it's hard. I love without walls. I forgive when it hurts, and arise through the storm. That's you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are on every Tuesday. Please feel free to come anytime. Invite people who you feel need this right now. And I just want to thank you once again, Shelly, for your time and just all that wisdom you gave us. And I will be sending this recording to everyone who registers, so you can go back and reflect on everything today. So thank you so much again. Awesome. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.